We've now reached the point in our journey where it's time to talk about what Grove Dictionary of Music describes as the most important principle of musical form or formal type from the classical period well into the 20th century. And so basically what they're saying there is that this is the way of structuring a piece that has been kind of most significant ever since around 1750, what we think of as the start of the classical period, right the way through. To be honest, we can even extend that to the 21st century and right the way up to 2014 when I'm making this video. In a way, if you look back through all of the greatest composers from the kind of European classical music tradition, they were all masters of this form and chose to use it right at the heart of so much of the music they wrote, and some of the most sort of well-known music as well that we still listen to today, even though it was written 200 years ago. Things like symphonies, concertos, and sonatas. And it's after this last form of composition that the thing takes its name. And so in this video we're going to have a look at introducing the idea of sonata form and asking the question in its most basic terms, what is sonata form? Well, to answer that we probably need to know what a sonata is. So a sonata is just simply any piece of music that is written normally for a solo instrument to play. There's a vocal version of this, which would be a cantata. So a cantata is a piece for people to sing. A sonata is a piece for people to play. And even though that's the most basic definition, over time the sonata developed into a kind of way of composing a piece as well as just being a piece that was played by an instrument. And so it had certain conventions and things that we might expect. And one of the things that became most common is that the first movement of each of these types of piece, whether a symphony, a concerto or a sonata, would use this special type of form called sonata form. And while it can seem very daunting because these are often very, very long pieces of music that can seem quite complicated, essentially what we're talking about here is a developed version of rounded binary form. And if you remember, rounded binary form was something that had two sections. It had an A section and a B section. And the thing that made it rounded binary is that it was completed, the B section was completed by some of the A section material coming back at some point towards the end of the B section. And that, on its most basic level, is what sonata form is. And we ultimately think of it in terms of three main sections. And if you can understand what we would expect a composer to be doing in each of those three sections, you can have a good idea as to what you should be listening out for if you ever go and listen to the first movement of a symphony or the first movement of a concerto or the first movement of a sonata where the composer has quite explicitly chosen to use this thing called sonata form. The three main sections that we would most commonly find in a piece composed in sonata form are as follows. So the first one is known as the exposition. And this is what we might think of as the A section. This is where some ideas are introduced and we get familiarized with some musical melodies for the first time. Then we have this second section, which is known as the development. And that is where the composer chooses to vary or play around with some of the things that they've done and transform some of the musical ideas they introduced in the exposition. And this is kind of the beginning of the B section. And finally, we have this thing called the recapitulation. And that's why I said this is most similar to a binary form with that rounded binary feel to it. So recapitulation. Long words, but ultimately very simple ideas here. So the recapitulation is this idea that at the end of the B section, we get some familiar A section material coming back. And that's the most basic scheme to describe a sonata form. But I think the best way to get a handle on how a sonata form works and what we should be looking out for is to actually go and have a look at one and explore each of the three sections in turn.